Good afternoon, everyone. I, Dr. Gurpreet Singh Popli from Akash Hospital, welcome all of you to this clinical meet of ISA Daily for the month of February. And the best part of this clinical meet is that this clinical meet is basically organized by four hospitals. They work together to have a good combination of four presentation. And before I start, I would like to thank God that COVID time is now recessing from India, and we now that we are coming back to our normal lives. I also want to thank God uh, for keeping us safe during this COVID time. I want to thank all the ISA office bearers for keeping the ball rolling in the tough times of COVID, in spite of COVID, and especially because of online platform, everything kept on rolling the way it was supposed to. The only thing we missed was meeting each other physically. But thankfully, we can actually get connected online with each other. Now, I hand over to Dr. Umesh Deshmukh for flag hoisting of ISA.
May I request all of you to please stand for the ISA flag hoisting.
Now, before starting the clinical session, let's invoke blessing from God Almighty for all that He has done for us. There is a small prayer song uh, just praying in front of God to keep us sound and safe in years to come.
Good afternoon. Let us together invoke the blessings of Supreme Lord who has bestowed us with this opportunity to serve humanity. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare
Now, before we start our scientific session, I would like to introduce all our office bearers of ISA Delhi chapter. Dr. Rajiv Gupta, he is governing council member from North India, representing, he happens to be our representation in ISA National. Dr. Nikhil Sabharwal is president of ISA Delhi. Dr. G. Usha is vice president ISA Delhi. Dr. Umesh Deshmukh is secretary of ISA Delhi. And Dr. Anu Vijayan Goyal happens to be treasurer of ISA Delhi. Dr. Parul Malik is editor of ISA Delhi, and Dr. Arvind Arya is General Council member of East Zone Delhi. Dr. Arun Mehra, General Council member, West Zone Delhi. Dr. Amit Kohli, General Council member of Central Zone Delhi. And Dr. Ashish Dang is General Council member of North Zone Delhi. Dr. Ranju Gandhi is General Council member from South Zone Delhi. Now I request Dr. Umesh Deshmukh to please speak and address the clinical meet.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, Gurpreet. How are you? Good evening, everyone. On behalf of ISA Delhi, I welcome you all to this clinical meet organized by the group of hospitals from Dwarka and West Delhi. Dr. Gurpreet happens to be an old friend, and thank you for the kind introduction. There are a lot of challenges that we are facing, particularly I want to speak about last Sunday, that was the 14th of February. The government has taken out an order which allows certain Ayush specialties to practice surgery, and that was one of the issues, core issues that faces our profession today. Though not directly but indirectly, we are responsible for patients' well-being during and after surgery, and anesthesiologists do play an important part in deciding who will operate. And we all have to think seriously about what impact does this order have on our specialty as such. And I would request everyone to think about it and please contribute your thoughts on various forums that we have. As far as the clinical meeting is concerned, I am very, very happy to welcome Dr. Popli, Dr. Taneja, Dr. Kalpana, and Dr. Lalit. I think this will be a good meet, and thank you so much. Dr. Popli, please welcome Dr. Nikhil Sabharwal to address the gathering.
Dr. Nikhil, I take an honor in welcoming you to this clinical meet. I request you to please address the forum, ma'am.
A very, very good afternoon to each and everyone. It is with such great pleasure that I see that today's meet has been organized, by West Delhi hospitals, getting 4 hospitals together to cooperate and, to come for presentation on one forum is itself a major feat. And I thank all our 4 HODs, especially Dr. Popli, who has been coordinating with us to have today's meeting, on this, the clinical meeting of ISA Delhi on this prestigious forum. So I'm really happy that, Action Balaji, Venkateshwar, Akash, and Manipal hospitals have gathered together. This was the main aim, to have as many hospitals as possible be represented on the clinical meeting forum of ISA Delhi. And due to COVID and due to these e-webinars, we have been able to accommodate many more hospitals. And I think it may be a first when 4 hospitals have come together. And you have a very good scientific program lined up. So I'm really eagerly waiting to hear the presentations today. Yes, we have a lot of challenges, like Dr. Umesh has mentioned, and we must protest against this mixopathy that the government is trying to roll out. It is really, really atrocious. Wherever it be, you cannot expect, doctors from other branches practice allopathy within a few months of training. So I think we must raise our voice against that. And I once again thank all of you for today's program. Long live ISA and long live ISA Delhi. Jai Hind. I hand over to Dr. Popley for conducting the scientific program.
Ma'am, I just want to know, is has Dr. Rajiv Gupta joined us? He doesn't seem to be on the attending list.
He is not there, Dr. Popley.
He's not there. So I think now let's move on to the scientific session. We have, before we move on to scientific session, I would like to introduce the 4 speakers who will be talking. Our first speaker is Dr. Neeta Taneja. She is HOD and Senior Consultant, Department of Anesthesiology, Shri Akshan Balaji Medical Institute. Ma'am has been working ever since 1989, and initially she worked in Central Government Health Services, and in 1995 she switched over to private practice. And her special interests are regional anesthesia and pediatric anesthesia. Our second speaker will be Dr. Namita Sharma. She is Senior Consultant in Anesthesia with us in Akash Healthcare, Dwarka. She was formerly working at Max Hospital and Columbia Asia Hospital. She has a keen interest in ultrasound-guided regional anesthesia and acute pain services, and she takes care of orthopedic anesthesia in our hospital. And at present, she is working on ERAS in arthroplasty, and that happens to be her talk also. She's also a member of ISA, and her hobbies are cooking, traveling, and listening to music. Dr. Sumit Gupta is specialist in liver transplant and anesthesia and critical care from Manipal Hospital, Dwarka. And he, after having graduated from Maulana Azad Medical College, he did his post-graduation in anesthesia from AIMS and then DNB. And after that, he did his PDCC in liver transplant anesthesia from ILBS Vasant Kunj. Welcome, Dr. Sumit. And our last speaker will be Dr. Kalpana Goyal, who is Senior Consultant and HOD and from Department of Anesthesia, Venkateshwar Hospital. Before joining Venkateshwar Hospital, she worked in AIMS, Maharaja Agasen, Rajiv Gandhi Hospital, and Shri Akshan Balaji Institute. And she has actively participated in structuring and designing her department and operation theatre and intensive care unit in Venkateshwar Hospital. She is an instructor with ACLS and BLS, and she also has been conducting liver transplant, kidney transplant, and bone marrow transplant too. Welcome, Dr. Kalpana. Now we switch over to scientific session, and I request all of you to please keep your videos switched off and keep yourself unmuted. Sorry, muted.
Good evening, all the seniors and fellow colleagues. First of all, I thank Dr. Nikki Sabharwal and her team for giving opportunity to private sector of West Delhi to share our professional experiences. I bring greetings from Shri Balaji Action Medical Institute, a 400-bedded multi-speciality hospital in Paschim Bihar. COVID times have taught us to face so many challenges, and we all have come out of it both professionally and emotionally. When the lockdown happened, we were all novices in how to deal with this highly communicable pandemic. We had to continue with emergency surgeries. Controversies regarding laparoscopic works were galore. We made arrangements for abdominal gases to pass through sodium hypochlorite as the surgeons wanted to proceed with laparoscopic work. But we were worried for aerosols during intubation, and this made us think for regional anesthesia. More and more regionals were considered, and for once, surgeons also cooperated for the same. Regionals for lap choles or any other laparoscopic work meant thoracic spinal. So we started search for references for the same. And this is what I'll be sharing today, how we managed during that time. And we continued to use some of the practices learned during that time. So we'll discuss segmental spinal anesthesia. And this is a term interchangeably used with thoracic anesthesia. In actual terms, segmental spinal is blocking of the required dermatomes essential for the proposed surgical procedure with very low effective local anesthetic drug. It necessitates dural puncture at high lumbar or mid to lower thoracic levels. And lower the dose, more likely it is to be a true segmental block. Now, going back to history, when we searched the history, I was surprised to know that more than 100 years from now, that is in 1909, Thomas Jonesco published a total of more than 1,000 thoracic spinal analgesia cases, all without death and without any serious complication. He punctured the subarachnoid space between T1 and T2 for analgesia of head, neck, and upper limbs, and at mid-thoracic and lower thoracic levels for thoracic and abdominal surgeries. But his work was criticized. First in 1910, when they said that spinal anesthesia is not yet recognized as a field of anesthesia. Then in 1911, in which complication of local anesthetics were discussed. So both the times it was not per se against thoracic spinal. Works continued, and in 1932, Kirchner used lateral position with head up. He aspirated CSF and injected air. He used hypobaric solution of Nupacaine, and subsequent injection of air would move the local anesthetic to the head region. Wehers also used a high approach. Then Etherington Wilson, they explained the block of spinal roots intrathecally using a glass model of spinal canal. So what they did, they injected the dye in this glass model and then made the glass model supine and checked for the spread of local anesthetic or the dye. And they found that the natural kyphosis of thoracic spine makes the drug stay there and not spread to lumbar or higher segments. Then in 1954, anatomical studies were done by Frumin and colleagues. They used a radio-opaque catheter and inserted through lumbar approach till T12. And they found that there is substantially more space in the dorsal subarachnoid space at thoracic level. Also, thoracic spinal puncture at T10 showed a rapid onset of action regardless of baricity, decreased incidence of hypotension, with faster recovery of the blockade, with low incidence of paresthesia and no spinal cord injuries in 636 patients studied. So with all these studies, it was concluded that if it were possible to limit anesthesia to the operative field and to use anesthetic agents in more diluted solutions and in smaller doses, certain undesirable effects of spinal anesthesia could be avoided. This is the fundamental reason for using segmental spinal anesthesia. Then 2006 saw a new era of studies on segmental spinal anesthesia. This is when J. Van Zundert punctured subarachnoid space at T10 for cholecystectomy in a severe COPD case. Many of you might remember this case was published in BJA when we were all, surprised to first we heard of thoracic spinal anesthesia. Now, with more and more studies done, its utility in many other different surgical procedures like awake thoracoscopic and thoracic surgeries, lap coolies and breast surgeries, etc., was found. Now, what is the present perspective? Presently, it has been used only in high-risk morbid patients for selective surgeries. Now, what we need to see is whether it will establish itself as a routine procedure in daycare anesthesia. It looks likely it will. We'll discuss all the advantages and all about segmental spinal shortly. But what we need to do is carefully select the patient and evaluate the patient well, and it has to be reserved for experienced clinicians. So what all types of cases that can be done? Practically all the abdominal surgeries, upper, lower, major or minor, daycare or not, laparoscopic or open, superficial thoracic surgery, breast surgeries, they are all possible with either segmental spinal alone, if the duration is around 60 to 90 minutes, or if more, you can combine it with epidural. And if that's not all, you could even use a continuous segmental spinal anesthesia using microcatheters, which are not yet available in India, but a lot of work is being done in Western countries, especially in European countries. The type of cases that we have done in our institute are lap coolies, total lap hysterectomy, total lap colectomy, one case, and modified radical mastectomy. So we'll discuss each one by one. For laparoscopic cholecystectomy, we puncture at T9, 10 or 10, 11 using 1.5 ml of isobaric levobupivacaine, 0.5%, along with 20 mics fentanyl, and level of anesthesia achieved is T4 to L2. Hemodynamics remains stable. This is just a video showing how the patient can easily move the lower limb. So level of anesthesia does not go to lumbosacral segments. This is how we conduct, do the surface marking. Then after giving local anesthesia, you just go millimeter by millimeter. And the moment you feel the give, remove the stellate, check for free flow of CSF by just rotating the needle a bit, and then inject 1.5 ml along with fentanyl. So total volume is about 2 ml. For total laparoscopic hysterectomy, we puncture at T10, 11, and here we use combined spinal epidural approach. In spinal, we give a mixture of hyperbaric bupivacaine followed by isobaric levobupivacaine in a different syringe, along with 20 mics fentanyl. And here, since we need an abdominopelvic anesthesia, the level is T4 to S4 and hemodynamics remains stable. This is a video showing after giving local anesthesia, we put in the epidural and then go in a routine way. The only thing is just check the angle. You have to make almost a 40 to 45 degree angle to get the space. And in fact, this is of an advantage because when the needle is moving obliquely, you get more space in the epidural area. The needle length, more needle can go in. This also I'll explain later. And once you get the epidural space, we use a needle through needle approach. with the same puncture and lock the needle. Inject first the hyperbaric levobupivacaine, about 1 ml, along with fentanyl. Once you have injected this, patient is sitting, so gets a dense sacral block. Now this will be followed by another syringe having isobaric levobupivacaine, 0.5%, about 1.5 ml is given slowly. The speed of anesthetic drug is same as you would use in any spinal. And once the injection is complete, you remove the needle and thread in the catheter in the usual manner. And this is the case going on. TLH. Patient has got a good abdominopelvic anesthesia, is kept sedated, monitoring the EtCO2, and the hemodynamics remain quite stable. For breast surgery, I have done only one case with the spinal. Others I have used epidural. Puncture at T5-6 level using 1 ml of 0.5% levobupivacaine with fentanyl, and level is T2 to T7, and patient remained stable. The adjuncts used for anxiety, we give midazolam 2 milligram before inserting the catheter. If there is any pain, like sometimes for lap coolies, they complain of shoulder pain, then 50 mics of fentanyl or ketamine 20 to 30 milligram. If hypotension occurs, ephedrine 5 milligram and bradycardia with atropine, all these are given as IV boluses as and when required. Now, what are the main problems? Whenever we are doing anything, we must know what side effects and problems can be there. And the main issues related to spinal at unconventional levels are risk of neurological injury, respiratory embarrassment, cardiovascular effects, and high or total block. The main anxiety is that of neurological injury. But spinal puncture at cervical and thoracic levels has been a regular practice for myelography. When MRIs were not available, then neurologists and radiologists were routinely doing myelographies and puncturing at cervical and thoracic levels without any side effects. Myelography studies showed that thoracic cord lies anteriorly in theca, while lumbar spinal cord is situated more dorsally. So lumbar spine is in fact at a greater risk of needle damage. Then more and more studies were done, MRI studies were also done, and it was seen that spinal cord and chorda equina are touching the dura mater posteriorly in the lumbar region and anteriorly in the thoracic region. And this position increases the distance to a point that allows needle advancement without touching the cord. This can be an explanation for low incidence of neurological complications during accidental perforation of dura mater in an attempt to perform a thoracic epidural block. Now, Imbeloni and Guvia have done extensive studies, and they found by MRI that the distance at T5, T6 between posterior dura and spinal cord is maximum, that is 7.75 millimeter. This is a sufficient distance to permit careful advancement of needle without touching the spinal cord. Then also the angle of entry of 40 to 45 degree at these levels. If you see, if the needle is going perpendicularly, then inside the space, the dura, before touching the cord, you get about 4.5 millimeter of distance, whereas when it goes obliquely, you get 8 millimeter of distance. So this is again of benefit. Imbeloni et al. Studied 300 patients subjected to thoracic spinal at T10-11, and they showed that incidence of paresthesia was 4.67% with cut needle and 8.6% with pencil point needle group without sequelae. This was much less than the incidence reported in lumbar spinal anesthesia. Then this was the study by Tetzelaff et al. And they found the incidence of paresthesia as 20% by lumbar approach and 6% by in the thoracic area. But still, we must know about the disadvantage that spinal cord damage is a potentially disastrous complication of spinal anesthesia, although rare, but the risk is there, and risk of permanent neurological deficit is 1 in 10,000. Now, second anxiety is that of respiratory embarrassment. When extensive thoracic nerve blockade occurs, it will lead to paralysis of anterior abdominal wall muscles, which may lead to some impediment in forceful expiration and coughing. But the main inspiratory muscle is diaphragm, which is usually unaffected. And use of low dose of drugs preserves the coughing ability by causing minimal motor weakness of expiratory muscles. So actually it has been seen that respiratory embarrassment doesn't occur in any of the patients. But still, where it can be disastrous, if the obstructive airway disease is such that the patient is dependent on active expiration to maintain lung ventilation, there you have to be careful. Also, pneumoperitoneum needs to be controlled carefully during surgery to ensure adequate diaphragmatic excursion. So it goes without saying that one needs to assess the patient very carefully, and anesthetist with considerable experience of regional anesthesia should be performing these blocks. Now, cardiovascular effects. Heart rate may decrease because we are blocking the cardioaccelerator fibers arising from T1 to T4. But what happens is that there is lumbosacral sparing. So there'll be less venodilatation in the lower limbs. So right atrial filling is maintained. And this sustains the outflow from intrinsic chronotropic stretch receptors located in right atrium and great veins. Also, we're using low doses, so hypotension is less. So what are the advantages? Let's enumerate all the advantages of segmental spinal. Surgeries which were thought to be out of domain of spinal anesthesia are now possible, like upper abdominal surgeries, superficial thoracic and breast surgeries, thoracoscopic procedures like bulectomy, thymectomy, lung volume reduction, and wedge resections. Then high levels of blocks can be achieved with just half the dose, which would have required with spinals given at lumbar levels. This means there are fewer hemodynamic fluctuations, early recovery, and voiding. Special advantages of over general anesthesia in patients with pre-existing respiratory comorbidities. This will avoid post-op pulmonary complications and patients going on ventilatory support. Lower incidence of post-op nausea and vomiting. It is very environment friendly because we are not using any of the gases or inhalational agents which have the greenhouse effect, and much less cost. In fact, one case of lap colectomy that we did was because the surgeon requested a regional anesthesia as the patient was not affording, and we could really save on the cost. The degree of muscle relaxation achievable without central or peripheral respiratory or circulatory depression is superior to that with general anesthesia. Danger of cardiac arrest is much diminished. Patients have motor control over their legs during the surgery, as I had shown you in my video, which means many patients have a high level of satisfaction with this technique and less anxiety. So what are the factors? Why there is success with such low dose at thoracic level? One is that amount of CSF at thoracic level is diminished compared to lumbar and cervical levels. And thoracic nerve roots are very thin compared to segments above and below. So because of these two factors, there is less anesthetic dilution in per segment. So that is why you get better effect with low dose. Also, onset time with isobaric solution in lumbar segment is longer than with hyperbaric, whereas in thoracic area, there is no significant difference with solutions. What dose of local anesthetic to be used and at what level? For all abdominal surgeries with an adequate dose, thoracic spinal above T10 is hardly required. Space between T10 and L1 is usually sufficient for all abdominal procedures. An average dose of 1.5 to 2 ml of bupivacaine with some additive works well for around 90 minutes. This dose is exactly half the amount required when you give spinal at lumbar level to achieve a T3 to T4 block. So what drugs are used for segmental spinal anesthesia? Both isobaric and hyperbaric drugs can be used. Combination of both can be used, as I have shown you in abdominopelvic surgery. In general, we use isobaric drugs are preferred for laparoscopic and thoracic surgeries, and hyperbaric is of choice in open surgeries, especially in male muscular patients where relaxation can be an issue. Among the available drugs, we have chlorprocaine 1%, levobupivacaine 0.5%, ropivacaine, bupivacaine heavy 0.5%. All can be used as per the need. What dose you would use? On an average, 1 ml of isobaric drug spreads 2 to 3 segments above and below the site of injection. So 2 to 2.5 ml of drug is sufficient to block segments from T2 to L5 if spinal is given at T10 level. In general, for all lap abdominal surgeries of 60 to 90 minute duration, a dose of 2 ml of isobaric levobupivacaine with fentanyl for female patients and 2.5 ml plus 20 mics fentanyl for male patients gives a given at T10 to 12 level is sufficient. And combination can be used. First, you give 0.5 to 1 ml of hyperbaric bupivacaine, followed by 2 ml of isobaric bupivacaine from a different syringe in sitting position. This can work for procedures like TLH or other abdominopelvic surgeries for up to 2 hours. Now, for prolonged surgeries and in patients with multiple comorbidities, we want to use very minimal dose in spinal, and epidural can be placed at same level or one space above. And epidural can also be used for epidural volume extension by saline. For thoracic and breast surgeries, give the spinal at T5 to 7 levels, 1 to 1.2 ml of isobaric levobupivacaine is good enough with fentanyl. For longer duration, of course, you will combine with epidural. So what is the take-home message? Number 1, low-dose segmental spinal is associated with remarkable cardiovascular stability. Patients with high BMI, cardiac and respiratory disease may be considered for daycare surgery. Advantages demonstrated are minimal hemodynamic fluctuation, minimal motor block, faster sensory recovery, early ambulation and voiding, less nausea and vomiting, environment friendly, and much less cost. An unusual anesthetic technique does not mean that it is wrong. But what we must remember is that patient safety takes precedence over unnecessary risks to be taken for success of procedure. So the technique is reserved for experienced clinicians working in defined and approved institutions. So in the end, I would like to say that there is never a right way to anesthetize a patient. Segmental or thoracic spinal provides an opportunity to expand the boundaries of regional anesthesia in a new way, which may be to the advantage of certain patients. Thank you. And any questions are welcome.
A very good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Namita Sharma, and I'm currently practicing in Akash Healthcare Dwarka as a senior consultant in the Department of Anesthesiology. First of all, a big thank you for providing me with this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. COVID has been a test of human resilience in all ways. And just like after every storm, we are looking for brighter, sunnier days ahead now. The stage in which India seems to be in, we believe that we'll be seeing more number of elective surgeries coming up to us in the theaters, and joint replacement surgeries will be one such subset of surgeries which will be on the surge in the coming months. Hence, I've decided to speak on ERAS in total knee replacement surgery, the SPEED knee program, as we call it. So what is ERAS? Enhanced recovery after surgery. It is actually a multimodal perioperative care pathway designed to achieve early recovery in patients undergoing major surgery. This was first introduced in 1997 by a Danish GI surgeon, Dr. Henrik Kehle, who in 2014 received the Excellence Award by the ASA for his outstanding contributions to anesthesia by the sheer creation of ERAS. So, Fast Track is actually a paradigm shift in perioperative care in two ways. First, it re-examines traditional practices and replaces them with evidence-based best practices wherever necessary. And second, it is comprehensive in its scope. Total knee arthroplasty is the definitive treatment for end-stage osteoarthritis. And with an increase in the longevity of our patients, we are bound to see a larger number of these surgeries coming up to us, and hence we need to establish practical strategies to improve the quality of healthcare, achieve earlier recovery and better outcome for these patients while facilitating a reduction in the heavy healthcare related economic burden in these. So why rapid recovery in TKR? Logistically, it leads to decreased length of stay, better utilization of resources, and hence economic saving. Surgically, it leads to better surgical outcomes, improved fixation of the prosthesis, and early mobilization. Medically, lesser complications, lesser blood loss, and better pain relief. But more importantly, psychologically, a sense of returning to normalcy earlier, being less dependent on attendants and family members. And I think that is a sense of major accomplishment after any surgery. So to make things easy for us, the ERAS Society has come up with a consensus statement for perioperative care in total hip and total knee replacement, which has been published in Acta Orthopedica in 2020. I have based my entire presentation on these guidelines. Broadly, they can be classified into three: pre-op, intra-op, and post-operative. Almost 21 of these components have been defined, and I will be taking each of them in detail. So the first pre-op recommendation is about pre-op information, education, and counseling. Of course, strongly recommended because it allays anxiety, builds up trust, and sets up realistic goals for the patient. Pre-admission patient optimization. So all those comorbidities and risk factors which could potentially delay discharges or complicate these patients should be dealt with prior to admission. For example, a 4-week or more of smoking cessation program, similarly an alcohol cessation program, and preoperative anemia investigation, identification, and correction prior to admission is strongly recommended. Pre-op physiotherapy. Pre-op physio has been proposed as an intervention to expedite discharge, and there is emerging work of adding nutrition therapy and psychological preparation to it in a concept called prehabilitation. Though current evidence does not support pre-op physio as an essential intervention, in SPEED knee, we include prehab in the pre-op preparation of our patient. Pre-op fasting. So intake of clear fluids up till 2 hours and solids for up till 6 hours prior to induction is recommended. A lot is being talked about pre-op carbohydrate treatment. So it is said that carbohydrate loading of these patients may help us in getting a metabolically well-fed patient, but that has not accelerated the discharge achievement and hence not currently recommended as an essential intervention in knee replacement surgery. Not so in GI surgeries. There it is a established norm. About pre-anesthetic medication, so the routine use of sedatives to reduce anxiety is not recommended. You can give short dose of sedatives to facilitate the technical procedure though. We used gabapentinoids and selective COX-2 inhibitors as a part of preemptive analgesia in our. So the standardization of anesthetic protocol is the core component of ERAS pathway in knee replacement surgery. The use of general versus central neuraxial anesthesia has been a long topic of debate, but now in large exemplar centers, the favor is towards neuraxial techniques. And this change in practice is at the core of established ERAS pathways. But the recommendation is that modern general and neuraxial techniques both can be used as a part of multimodal anesthetic regime. A word about spinal opioids. Spinal opioids are not recommended for routine use by ERAS, but we use low dose fentanyl in our practice. Talking about epidurals. Epidural analgesia is not recommended for routine use in hip and knee replacement because of the potential for adverse effects, which could potentially delay recovery. Use of local anesthetics for nerve blocks and infiltration analgesia. So local infiltration analgesia, highly recommended for knee replacement, not so for hip replacement. Nerve block techniques provide equal analgesia, but when compared to the LIA, they consider that motor blockade could limit our discharges and mobilizations, and hence not an essential ERAS component as of yet. But I would add here that in speed knee program at our organization, motor sparing nerve blocks have been the game changers, and we have been using them routinely in all our patients. Postoperative nausea vomiting. So evidence supports the use of screening and prophylaxis and treatment for patients undergoing these surgeries. So any patient who has more than 2 risk factors should be pre-medicated with either ondansetron plus minus dexamethasone. Prevention of perioperative blood loss. So blood transfusion, we know, carries a myriad of complications with it, like transfusion reactions, disease transmission, deep infections, renal failure, and even death. So all possible steps to prevent transfusions must be taken up. Tranexamic acid seems to be a sane option and a safe option to prevent blood transfusion, because it prevents the breakdown of the fibrin clot by inhibiting the activation of plasminogen, plasmin, and TPA. So the recommendation is highly to use it locally as well as systemically. Multimodal analgesia. So as anesthetists, we understand that combining analgesics of various classes yields better analgesic results and decreases the utilization of opioids, which we know have a lot of unwanted side effects. So that is the cornerstone of exemplar ERAS pathways. Paracetamol and NSAIDs being the important drugs in the same. Optimal pain management, needless to say, is a prerequisite for ERAS, and novel drugs are being studied like ketamine and glucocorticoids. Talking about our very favorite paracetamol or Cabimol, it is routinely prescribed perioperatively, leads to decrease in pain scores and decrease in opioid consumption of the patient. Also seemingly helps in PONV. So because of its help in acute postoperative pain, its beautiful side effect profile, it is a core component of multimodal analgesia. NSAIDs are the age-old drugs for pain relief, but we need to individually see the patient's risk factor before we prescribe NSAIDs to our patients. So patients with deranged renal functions, liver functions, or maybe bleeding diastasis. So you can give NSAIDs to patients until and unless they are contraindicated. I would just like to add that in our organization, we do not use even a single dose of a non-selective NSAID onto our knee replacement patient. Opioids. So the quintessential fundamental of ERAS is to minimize the use of opioids. And nevertheless, if they are required, they can be given, but minimize the usage as much as you. Maintaining normothermia. So NICE in 2016 came up with the guidelines that said pre-warming and active warming of all patients is a must. And we know of various techniques like pre-warming and humidifying the gases, using warmer IV fluids, and forced air warming blankets and devices. So hypothermia must be prevented because it delays the antimicrobial prophylaxis. So Infection after knee replacement is totally unacceptable and a very serious complication, and hence patients should receive antimicrobial prophylaxis in accordance with the local policy. Antithrombotic prophylaxis. So for this, IRAS strongly says that the patient should be mobilized as soon as possible and also receive antithrombotic prophylaxis in accordance with the local policy. About the perioperative surgical factors, so IRAS has no conclusive evidence that choice of surgical approach accelerates the achievement of the discharge criteria, and hence no recommendation, though the use of tourniquet and drains routinely is not recommended by. The fluid management is goal directed. It says that intravenous fluids should be used judiciously and post-op IV fluids should be discouraged in favor of early oral intake. Recommendation on the urinary catheter use is that they must not be used and should be removed if at all they are used, as soon as the patient is able to void, ideally within 24 hours after completion of the surgery. A catheterization threshold of 800 ml is used to reduce the need for post-operative catheterization. Post-operative nutritional care. So an early return to normal diet, highly recommended. Early mobilization, key to the IRAS program. Patients should be mobilized as soon as possible following surgery. Outpatient surgeries are now established for almost 13 to 15% of these patients, and hence early mobilization is essential. Because this is all about early discharges, so setting up objective criteria for discharge is definitely important. So some of these criteria are ability to dress independently, the ability to get in and out of bed, the ability to sit and rise from a chair or a toilet seat, the ability to be independent with personal care, and to be able to walk for more than 70 meters with crutches are some of those criteria. Last but not the least, continuous improvement on audit is a critical component for quality improvement in any program in healthcare. So based on all of these, we ushered into a new era of TKR in December 2019 with the launch of the SPEED Knee program. So what is SPEED? SPEED is actually an acronym that stands for safe, painless, express recovery, exact fit, and durable. The goals of our program were to achieve early functional recovery, early mobilization, make it painless, yet opioid-free and non-selective NSAID-free, reduce the length of stay with a vision towards daycare TKR, reduce the complication and readmission rate, and hence devise a cost-effective surgical. The team comprises of the surgeons, the anesthesiologists, the physiotherapists, nursing staff, OT staff, the admin, and audit and research team. So in the pre-op phase, the PAC is a very important interaction between us and the patients because we assess them, we get references, we correct comorbidities, stratify the risk, take up the consents, and also have the opportunity to introduce the concept of the pain assessment tools we'll be using, the concept of pain management that we'll be using, and patient-controlled analgesia is introduced to the patient at that interaction itself. We also do prehabilitation. We also show them walkthrough videos during that phase. As I told, we use low-dose gabapentinoid and selective COX-2 inhibitor night prior and 2 hours prior to surgery. 6 hours solid and 2 hour liquid fasting protocol is being followed at our institute. Antibiotic prophylaxis. So 1 hour prior to incision, strict adherence to the local hospital antibiogram. We definitely give the antibiotics to our patients. For thromboprophylaxis, we routinely give low molecular weight heparins 12 hours prior to surgery and then repeated in the post-op period almost 8 hours after the surgery. A small word about patient selection, that the choice between unilateral and bilateral is again a team decision, wherein it is based on the comorbidities and other factors related to the patient. Choice of anesthesia. So both regional and general anesthesia have been safely administered, though we have a bent towards regional anesthesia and we prefer using low dose spinal anesthesia with or without low dose of fentanyl. We only use pencil tipped thin bore needles, avoiding multiple punctures, and judiciously use epidurals in indicated circles. But the game changer in the program have been the ultrasound guided motor sparing peripheral nerve blocks. We use adductor canal, IPAC, local infiltration analgesia, weaker or diluted drugs in the femoral nerve blocks, and peripheral nerve catheters for infusions. So this is one of our patients receiving the adductor canal block at the end of the surgery. There are multiple studies now which say that the continuous adductor canal block is highly superior to the continuous femoral nerve block in promoting early ambulation because the quadriceps function is better preserved in ADC. And that are some screenshots of us putting in the ADC catheter. And I have a small video wherein, so by a 2 Hoy needle, I am identifying the ADC, hydro dissecting it, and now I'll be putting in an 18 gauge catheter into the ADC, checking for correct placement. And once I'm sure, I am going to tunnel the catheter and fix it securely. IPAC, or the interspace between the popliteal artery and the posterior capsule of the knee, blocks the innervation to the posterior capsule of the knee joint while sparing the tibial and the common peroneal nerve and hence maintaining the sensory motor function of the leg, and can be given either through a posterior approach or an anterior approach, which we routinely use in the local infiltration anesthesia or the periarticular injection. That involves a series of injection into the knee in the areas which have concentrated pain fibers. That's done by the surgeon, and every hospital, I believe, has their own cocktail. Ours is this one, which contains ketorolac, clonidine, epinephrine, and a word about surgical technique. So we use the robotic technique. We have the Navio Generation 4, and we've realized that it leads to a perfect alignment of the implant, decreases the tissue handling and the bone cutting, hence the blood loss is reduced and the pain scores are better. Also, the choice of doing unicondylar knee replacement in indicated patient instead of TKR also leads to faster recovery. The PONV prophylaxis is as per the Iraq recommendations. Fluid therapy is goal directed. We do not put in urinary catheters in unilateral knee replacement. Maintain normothermia. We definitely use tourniquets as per the SOP of our hospital. Intravenous tranexamic acid is used prior to deflation tourniquet. But early mobilization is the key to this program. So our patients walk almost as early as 1 hour after the surgery. And definitely we know that that leads to lesser thromboembolic events, better pulmonary and cardiac preservation, and a better wound healing. A single dose of IV Cabimol is given prior to ambulation and followed by oral analgesia regimen. 2 hours after the surgery, patients are given normal enteral nutrition. So anesthesiologists have suddenly become the pain chasers in the hospital. And the pain relief is multimodal, safe. We use LA infusions in peripheral nerve catheters. And apart from that, we use oral PCM, tramadol, pregabalin, and etorecoxib. Patient-controlled analgesia has been introduced and now being used on all our patients. And hence, we have placed the control of pain relief in their own hands. Non-pharmacological methods like cryotherapy are routinely used, but we do not use any opioids and we do not use any non-selective NSAIDs. Stringent twice daily record keeping. So this is one of the videos of our patients walking 1 hour post-operatively, and it is a beautiful sight for all of us who are involved into that program. Similarly, these are some screenshots of patients with the patient-controlled analgesia. You can see the pouch containing the PCA pump on the patient. And this is a beautiful video again. The patient is carrying the PCA pump attached to the ADC catheter and is ambulating beautifully. So we standardized our process by putting the patients in HDU care for almost 24 hours after the surgery. And the discharge is definitely on objective criteria, which we've already discussed. And we have an audit team in place, which helps us, gives us feedback and motivates us to improve. And I'm very happy to share some of our early results. So the length of stay in unilateral knee replacement after the SPEED knee program was implemented in our own organization showed that before it was 5.12 average days, and now it is 3.65, which is a reduction of almost 1.5 days. And similarly, in bilateral knee replacement, we achieved a reduction from 5.6 days to 4.21 days. So my final thoughts on this is that post-corona, we are all looking at shortening hospital stays and making it safer for patients to get elective surgeries done with us. And ERAS reduces length of hospital stay, decreases the financial burden and post-operative complications. The anesthesiologist plays a critical role in orchestrating the smooth functioning of any such rapid recovery program. So talent wins matches, but teamwork wins championships. Thanks a lot for your patient listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all. I welcome you on behalf of Manipal Hospitals, Dwarka. I'll be presenting on defasciculating dose before phenylcholine, old technique revisited during pandemic. As we all know, anesthesia technique has been modified tremendously across all organizations in response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. PPE kits, N95 masks, goggles, shields, and plastic drapes are the new normal. Further, rapid sequence induction and intubation are the norm for all intubations in the current COVID-19 pandemic era. Neuromuscular blockers used for this rapid sequence induction and intubation are either rocuronium or succinylcholine. Succinylcholine is a preferred choice over rocuronium as it has a shorter duration of action, which offers substantial safety if you happen to encounter an unanticipated difficult airway. With rocuronium, the intubating dose is likely to last longer and is not suitable if surgery is going to finish in less than 90 minutes. Sugammadex, the reversal agent utilized for rocuronium, isn't available in India. The drawback of succinylcholine is that it causes fasciculations prior to adequate relaxation. Any movement highly increases the possibility of aerosol spread and cause rise in intracranial pressure. Further, it can cause myalgias in post-operative period. Defasciculating dose of non-deposing muscle relaxant, usually 1/10 of the intubating dose is given. It is being used for decades. It preserves the beneficial safety effects of succinylcholine and avoids any undesirable effects which are due to fasciculations. However, as rocuronium and sugammadex have come into use, its use has been reduced. Primary objective of this study was to determine the safety of succinylcholine combined with a defasciculating dose of itracurium and to determine the number of attempts required for intubation. Secondary objective was to note any adverse events. We obtained the ethical committee clearance from Institutional Ethical Committee at Manipal Hospitals, Dwarka. Electronic and printed records were analyzed retrospectively and prospectively. Parameters noted were age, gender, comorbidities, ACE status, diagnosis, duration, and type of surgery. We also noted the time to intubation, use of agents, COVID status, nature of surgery, emergency or elective, number of attempts to intubation, coughing or bucking, or any fasciculations occurring despite non-deposing muscle relaxant. We collected the electronic data via hospital information system and utilized printed patient records. It was a retrospective observational study, so all patients intubated with the prescribed technique between April 1st to June 30th were included. Duration of the study again was between April 1st to June 30th, 2020. These 3 months were done to analyze the technique and to find any drawbacks. And subsequently, we modified the said technique and are using it even now. Inclusion criteria: age was between 18 to 70 years on all patients undergoing general anesthesia with the said technique. Exclusion criteria were contraindication to succinylcholine, anticipated difficult airway, hyperkalemia, allergy to succinylcholine or itracurium, or neurosurgical patients. A total of 116 patients underwent surgery and were intubated with the prescribed technique. Out of these, 60 were female and 56 were male. Average age was similar in both the genders, around 46 years. Average weight in females was 63 kgs and males were around 10 kgs heavier with average weight of 74 kgs. Most of the patients were between the age group of 20 to 60. Around 73% patients were from this age group. Average duration was around 170 minutes. Most of the patients had some comorbidities and were from ASA 2 to ASA 4. Only a few patients were ASA 1. Despite this, no adverse events were noted with the prescribed technique. As we can see from this table, they had various comorbidities, but with the combination of defasciculating dose of itracurium and succinylcholine, no adverse events were noted during the intubation. General surgery was the most common specialty with the highest number of cases. Laparoscopic cholecystectomy was the most common surgery performed. 24 orthopedics cases done, and gynecology and oncosurgeries comprised of the majority of the cases in this study. Buji was required in 2 patients for intubations, and all patients were successfully intubated. COVID status wasn't known in 8 cases. However, later they turned out to be COVID negative, and rest 108 were COVID negative at the time of surgery. 9 emergency cases were present and 107 elective cases were done. Mostly itracurium was used. Fasciculation was noted in 20% patients, around 23 out of 160. Myalgias were rare. Adverse events: 4 patients complained of uneasiness before induction after administration of defasciculating dose of non-depolarizing muscle relaxant. Rocuronium was administered for rapid sequence induction in 1 patient, as the preoperative potassium was 5.1 millicurrents and anticipated duration was above 2 hours and airway examination was within normal limits. No patient developed any desaturation or any other adverse event. A point I would like to highlight is that speaker and both the moderators suffered but successfully recovered from COVID-19. Incidence of myalgias is around 1.5 to 50% in various studies. However, some studies quote an incidence of over 89% as well. Small dose of non-depolarizing neuromuscular blocking drugs is given 3 minutes prior to succinylcholine, as it decreases the incidence of fasciculation and myalgias. Myalgias are seen up to 2 to 3 days. However, they can last up to 1 week. On the first day of surgery, they typically manifest as pain after unaccustomed exercise. They are mostly seen in neck, shoulders, and upper abdominal muscles. They are more common in females and less in children and adults over 50 to 60 years of age. Because of early ambulation, they are more commonly seen in minor surgeries as compared to major surgeries. Fasciculations are due to vigorous contraction of muscle bundles. Antidromically conducted axonal depolarization is the proposed mechanism because of agonistic action of succinylcholine on prejunctional nicotinic receptors at neuromuscular junction. D-tubocurarine and phenytoin, they prevent action of succinylcholine on motor nerve terminals. Generalized fasciculations are seen due to asynchronous repetitive firing because of the activation of these nicotinic receptors by succinylcholine. In our study, fasciculation occurred despite the defasciculating dose. This might be attributed to inadequate time prior to succinylcholine administration, and cold chain might not be properly maintained for intracranial. Myalgias, as I have mentioned earlier, most of myalgias are similar to unaccustomed exercise. Muscle damage produced by the shearing forces associated with fasciculations at the onset of phase 1 block is the proposed mechanism. Hyperkalemia often accompanies these myalgias. Uneasiness following the defasciculating dose can be minimized with administration of anxiolytics like IV midazolam. So with small dose of non-depressive muscle relaxant, we are blocking the pre-junctional receptors at neuromuscular junction. With self-taming, postulated mechanism is neuromuscular desensitization, again occurring at neuromuscular junction. Defasciculating drugs, precuriorization utilizes small dose of D-tubercularine or non-depressive muscle relaxant. Around 10% of the ED95 is utilized and 3 minutes should elapse. Defasciculating doses of succinylcholine and non-depressive muscle blockers cause reduction in fasciculation and myalgias. However, this effect is drug specific and is dependent on the interval between non-depressive muscle blockers and succinylcholine. Most effective is D-tubercularine followed by etraquirine, and least effective is vecuronium. Higher doses of succinylcholine are recommended. Another technique is self-taming. In this technique, small dose of succinylcholine around 10 milligrams is used as pre-treatment prior to the full dose. Proposed mechanism is neuromuscular accommodation or desensitization. So non-depressive muscle relaxant used for defasciculation. Etraquirine or rocuronium has similar doses of around 0.05 milligrams per kg. Vecuronium has lesser dose of 0.01 milligrams per kg. Priming dose of non-depressive muscle relaxant was utilized at our institute in urology cases, as serum potassium tends to be on the higher side in these patients. So using succinylcholine wasn't an optimal choice. Hence, around 10% of the intubating dose was administered, followed by full dose. And the onset of action was around was reduced by 1 minute. To conclude, rapid sequence induction and intubation utilizing the administration of defasciculating dose of non-depressive muscle relaxant prior to succinylcholine is safe. Optimal conditions for intubation were provided and myalgias were absent. At the same time, fasciculations were significantly reduced. It also avoided any neuromuscular blockade when it wasn't necessary. Thank you.
Good afternoon, eminent members and faculty of ISA Delhi. I am Dr. Kalpana Goyal from Venkateshwar Hospital, Dwarika. Going to present my topic, emergency elective surgery in COVID pandemic and how we managed it. When COVID thing started in country, there were constant evolving policy and a lot of confusion was going on. It started with the travel ban, then complete lockdown, and we don't know how to proceed for the elective or emergency surgeries, as different policies and different guidelines were coming from the different societies. Whether to do surgery with the PPE kit or without the PPE kit, we don't know. And if to do with the PPE kit, PPE kit were not available in the country. Whether to wear the N95 mask or the 3-ply mask, and if to wear the N95, it was not available in the market. What is screening to be done for the patient, and it is for the all patient or only for the symptomatic patient, whether it should be RT-PCR or rapid antigen or no test. Whether to keep the ICU beds and ventilator vacant for the patient who are likely to come in a lot for because of the pandemic, or we have to proceed for the normal patient. So the strategy for maintaining the standard protocol of anesthesia care was required, which need that there should be the minimum chances for exposure to the healthcare worker. Whatever the policy we made, we should be remain adherent to the protocol. There should be best perioperative care able to provide it to the patient. While doing the anesthesia and surgery, the precautions to be taken, especially in the aerosol generating procedures, to prevent the infection in the normal healthcare worker, there should be limited movement of the personnel inside and outside the OT, and to have a monitor and manage the healthcare worker who are having any symptoms or fallen sick. So the Venkateshwar Hospital response was that we made some protocol which are very simple and to be followed by every and each person who is there in the OT. The first thing was to constant wearing of the N95 mask. Whoever is coming in the OT, whether they are the doctors, they are the technician, or the nursing staff, even if some engineering department person need to come to the OT, they have to wear the N95. Even it is for the our cleaning personnel, if it is for the guards, for everyone, it was the policy to constantly and each and every time to wear the N95 mask. The person who is facing the patient need to wear the face shield or the visor, and it was provided by the hospital. There was a separate lift and the separate area for the COVID patient, where the ward was there, the ICU is there, and whenever there is any movement of the patient, need to do in any other area, there was green corridor created for the movement, and it help in avoiding the infection to the other person present in the other area. There was separate entry and exit for that particular COVID being, so that unwanted movement can be prevented and other patient or the personnel having the minimum exposure. As the different guidelines are coming from the different society to take the ideas from that guidelines, we have created our own COVID OT in our hospital, which is having the separate AHU, so the air doesn't get mixed with the other areas. There is separate entry and exit in that particular OT. There is dedicated donning and doffing area, and as advised by the guidelines that in the COVID OT there should be a negative pressure, but in our OT all the OT is having the positive pressure. So and we try to we worked on to create the negative pressure, but it was not possible. So we asked engineering department to make it a neutral pressure, so the minimum chances of air mixing to the other areas. There are certain measures were taken to reduce the infection. Initially, all the patient, when the policies were not very clear, and we doesn't have the separate OT. Initially, all the patients who are coming in the OT are suspected as a positive, and we treat as a positive patient only, and we operate all the patient with the N95 mask. But later on, when the policy was formed, only the high-risk patient or the positive patient were operated with the N95 with the PPE kit in the separate OT, and rest of the patient who are negative with the RT-PCR or CBNet are operated in the main OT complex area. At the time of lockdown, when the patient load was not so high and the infection rate was high in the society, and a lot of anxiety was there, so we divided our OT staff in the two group, One group used to come for 15 days and another group used to come for another 15 days. And there was no mixing of the staff in between. So that if one group of the staff get infected, we have the manpower available for to take care the things. And whenever the case is there in the OT, there is a minimum staff or is there as far as possible. The strict hand hygiene practice was maintained, and there was already announcement for the hand hygiene there by the hospital. HV case prophylaxis were given to all the healthcare worker. When the guidelines were changed, it was discontinued. To have our policies for the COVID area, it is started with the pre-operative measures. In the PSC, we did the certain changes. Like like in the pre-operative area, we did some changes. Like we created a barrier of the plastic screen between the treating doctor and patient. So in the PSC area, only the one patient, or if the patient is very sick, only one attendant was allowed. And because of this screen, there is no direct contact between the doctor and patient. Even while the auscultating the patient, we have the screen in between, so that get the minimum exposure. As I already mentioned, in all patient, we get the RT-PCR or the CBNet done. When the patient is positive, and if it is elective surgery, it was postponed till the recovery. Patient is recovered from the infection and the negative report is available. And if it is a positive case and it need to be done in the emergency basis, we created some guidelines to do like IL-6 ferritin level, D-dimer level, or and PT-INR levels, so that we can stratify the risk and then explain the risk to the patient and attendants. And of course, N95 was mandatory for all the patients, whether they are negative or positive. And it started the wearing N95 from the pre-op area. In the intraoperative measures, we did some modification in our plan, like whenever it is not necessary, we treated all the patient and surgery was performed using regional or anesthesia or total intravenous anesthesia. And if it is need to do in the general anesthesia, we preferred using the laryngeal mask airways, IGLs, rather than intubating the patient. And if intubation is required, all the patients were given the pre-op glycopyrrolate if it is not contraindicated. Intubation was done using the intubation box. It is not only the intubation mask, but the treating physician, anesthetist, was also used to wear the C-arm cover on the head and chest, so that if the patient cough or have some aerosol generation, it is having a double protection. All the intubation was done using video laryngoscopy, of course, after the rapid sequence induction. And exhaled gases was taken out by the AGSS, and it is released in the basement-free area where our manifold is situated, and from where the gas was treated and then released to the atmosphere. In all the patients who is required the GA, the filters were used, which are the viral filter rather than the normal filters. In orthopedics OT and the procedures where drill is required or saw is required, we request the surgeon to use it in as minimum as possible, because this procedure also generates a lot of aerosols. In laparoscopic surgery, the gases which normally release in the atmosphere, we modified this thing, and the gases were suctioned out using another suction port, and it was again released in the basement free where manifold is there. Whenever the intubation was done, with the minimum staff, and surgeon and other staff was allowed only 15 minutes after the intubation. Same for the extubation also. at the time of extubation, the minimum staff is there in the OT, and rest of the staff are asked to stay outside. For the contact tracing, we have created a form in the OT. So whoever the patient is coming in the OT, we in this form we collect the data of the patient along with who is the anesthetic surgeon, the pediatrician, technician, scrub nurse is there, and what the time the surgery was done, and what the status, the COVID status of the patient at that time. So if the patient when come in the OT is negative but later on found to be positive, we can track the who was there in the OT and what were the chances of exposure, and if the patient is having many symptoms and we found that this staff need to be quarantined, we can do it. But fortunately, we are not required because all the patients who are coming in OT, proper screening was done. So later we didn't found any patient who came positive later on. And if positive, when the after discharge, 3-4 days after the discharge, the patient become positive, it was not in the pre-derma phase. There are certain changes in the done in the post-operative area also. So after the extubation, the patient was stabilized in the OT only and directly shifted from OT to the ward to have the minimum exposure to the other patient. And if the patient is need to be shifted to the post-op area, the one bed is remain vacant in between the two patients. In the post-op area, also the patient need to wear constantly the N95 mask. The staff which is posted in the post-operative area was dedicated to monitor that need of the patient only. If the positive case need to be shifted to the ward, the green corridor were created. After each and every case, the instruments and equipments which used during the surgery were properly sterilized. And every time each set were opened, laryngoscope also properly sterilized after each use. And after each case, proper meticulous cleaning was done in the OT, and we have strictly maintained the contact time after mopping and cleaning of the by the disinfectants. There are the few procedures which are having the chances of more aerosol generating, and we can't avoid it, like the bronchoscopies, tracheostomies, ERCPs, in which we directly surgeon directly operate on the mouth or nose. So these patients, we all of these patients we consider as a positive, and these procedures though done in the main OT complex, but it was done with the PPE kit only. Whenever there is as we already said that whenever there is a positive case, it was done in the dedicated COVID OT, which is situated in the basement 3, and it is away from the main OT complex, so that the normal patient doesn't get any exposure. Any patient which need to be done in the emergency basis, and we don't have the time for the report, we don't have time to wait for the report to become. In that case, we taken the sample for the COVID, results is awaited, but we treated it as a positive only and operated it on the dedicated COVID OT only. By following all these guidelines, we are able to maintain our OT quite disease-free. There was no case detected which have come positive from the OT, and we are able to do lot many cases even during the pandemic time. So you can see from this graph that in January, February, and March months, there was almost more than 500 cases. In the March, it started declining as the lockdown started. But in April, it was drastically low, as there was no movement at all for a patient to come to the hospital. but it started increasing from the month of the May. And from the month of the May, it gradually increasing, and now it is come to the normal, the pre-COVID area. Even during the total lockdown, we are able to perform minimum of 170 surgery per month. And after this, gradually, it was in the increasing trend only. During this pandemic time, we did all kind of elective and high-end surgeries in our OT, which include the 8 liver transplant, 14 kidney transplant. There was lot many onco surgeries, which are very major type, right from the pneumonectomy to the commando surgeries to the gynae onco surgeries. So in this pandemic time, we did 319 oncology surgery. Lot many laparoscopic surgeries we did, which is right from the Whipple surgery, laparoscopic Whipple surgery, laparoscopic nephrectomy, laparoscopic hysterectomies, and laparoscopic gynae surgeries also. And even with all this laparoscopic surgery, we able to pull through, and no patient or doctor have contracted any COVID infection during this period. Even the patient who are like onco patient or transplant patient who are even immunocompromised, and lot of doctors and patient are skeptical whether to get it operated or not because of the COVID thing. But as our hospital is remain COVID free, so the patient had the confidence that if they will get operated here, they will not get infection. And fortunately, we are able to maintain that. So this is the thing we discussed, which was the for the pandemic time. But now, as the pandemic is receding, so and herd immunity is developing, vaccinations also come. So we have to think that we need to follow the same guidelines, or we need to change it a little bit. Because if we change, as we are also hearing that other mutation strains are coming, or some other biological threat is there, and we really don't know what is the efficacy of the vaccine is there. Initially, the surgery was curtailed in the government or other hospital because of the resource allocation was there. The implication of this reduced surgery was that the patient is suffering has increased. Patient will have the difficult diseases. The diseases become the complications. Disease complications are there, which is causing the financial implications on the patient and increasing the backlog on the OT. So every hospital need to prioritize the cases. To have some guidelines of the recovered patient, the American Society of Anesthesiologists and American Anesthesia Foundation Safety have given some joint statement for the elective surgery when to do when the patient is recovered from the COVID infection. So they stated that it should be the 4 weeks waiting time for the asymptomatic patient or patient who had only mild non-respiratory symptoms. There should be waiting time for 6 weeks for the symptomatic patient who had mild symptoms like cough or dyspnea, but not needed hospitalization. It should be wait time of 8 to 10 weeks for the symptomatic patient who was having some comorbidities like diabetes or immunocompromised or needed hospitalization because of the COVID thing. And the waiting time should be the 12 weeks for the patient who was admitted in the intensive care because of the COVID thing or went into the ventilator. Some scoring system also devised to prioritize the patient for the surgery and to analyze the risk benefit. In the MENT score, they said that if the patient MENT score is less than 25, the surgical outcome will be very good and the resource utilization is favorable. But if the score is high and if we do the surgery, there could be a worse outcome and it is not a good utilization of the resources. So we need to weigh whether it is beneficial for the patient or not to do the elective surgery. If we talk about the future, now the things are changing and I think need to change our policy or not. We really don't know. The dilemma is going on. What will be the role of the RT-PCR, whether we should continue to do it in all the patients who are coming in the OT, or this policy will change, whether the antibody level, getting done antibody level will be the better policy rather than the RT-PCR, we don't know, or what will be the other alternative for that. And for the recovered patient also, like many recovered patients are coming, they remain on the anticoagulants. They had complications during their hospital stay. So what should be done? What is the best for the patient and what precautions to be taken? We really don't know. As now vaccination started and healthcare worker and patient are also getting vaccinated. So in the future, we don't know what will be the policy, like if the patient is get vaccination done. So we should consider the patient negative, and if negative, after how much time of the vaccination. Even after vaccination, whether we need to do the RT-PCR test or antibody test, it is also not clear, because the efficacy of the vaccine, we don't know. No one knows how much the efficacy will be there. As the COVID time, we had dedicated OTs, dedicated ward, and dedicated ICU. But as the COVID patients are coming less and less in the every hospital, so are we still need to keep our dedicated OT for the COVID thing, dedicated ICU and ward should be keep vacant for the COVID thing, or we can utilize it for the normal patient? Because if for the indefinite time we'll keep it vacant, it will be really wastage of the hospital resources. And are we really prepared for the new pandemic? And we need to formulate more guidelines, or can we use these guidelines for future pandemic? We really don't know. So far, so good. Thank you so much. We are able to pull through. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Neeta, Dr. Namita, Dr. Sumit, and Dr. Kalpana for such an excellent academic feast. Now the house is open for question and answers. Anyone who has any doubts or wants to ask any queries to the speakers, they can ask. Yes, Dr. Ranju. Question.
Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yes, Dr. Ranju,
Okay.
you are audible.
Okay. So my question, I particularly liked all the presentations, but particularly the first presentation on segmental spinal anesthesia. I wanted to ask, Madam, were there any conversions? I mean, in any of the procedures in the patients conducted to general anesthesia? And did she give any continuous TUR in any of the procedures? Ma'am mentioned about midazolam and IV Fenta and ketamine as boluses. So that is my query.
Ma'am, Dr. Neeta, please unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yeah, Apollo.
In the limited number of cases that I have done, I have not converted any to general anesthesia. And of course, I have used TIVA. Of combination of ketamine, propofol sometime, a little bit for shoulder pain and fentanyl. That's all. In my TLH and lap colectomy also, I used a bit of TIVA. That's all. But I think that doesn't call for a failure of a block because you have to keep the patient comfortable during the surgery.
Yes. Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I would, because this was a very, I think I was very passionate about this work, and so I would love to answer queries.
Small query, and are you, I mean, like you stressed on the expert anesthesiologist and setup. So from your standpoint, because of the risk of say like respiratory complications and neurological complications anticipated, what was your extra vigilance? I mean, did you have any sort of extra, I mean, sleepless nights or anything? I'm just asking. And how much did you follow up your patients operatively?
I have followed up most of my patients, and they did very well. They did very well because they were very comfortable more because the motor and of the lumbosacral area was there, so they could move it. So lab coolies were very happy, and they had good stop pain relief as well without any block being given to them. Even the surgeons were happy. Even for TLH, initially gynecologists were a little hesitant because thinking of TLH under regional, they were very this thing, but I said, okay, I'll just go ahead, and if you have any problem, I'm there to give GA. Even they were very happy. So I have no problem in any of the cases.
Another thing, surgeon has to be very, very proficient.
Yes, actually.
Obviously, you might be anesthesiologist, but your surgeon has to be really good and very proficient, like to be.
That's very right. Because if the duration increases too much, then patient does become a little uncomfortable.
And ma'am, did you use any restraints? Because there is no motor block of the extremities, and you see TLH and all, there is like sort of you make the patient.
See, for TLH, you give a abdominoperineal block. So patient is in lithotic position, and there even the sacral segments are blocked because I'm giving a mixture of hyperbaric and isobaric. For lap coolies, it usually is finishes in less than an hour. So patient did not move the legs at all.
So you didn't put any extra restraints?
No, I didn't.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Kalpana.
Yes, Dr. Neeta. Because this is the new thing, and most of the people are not doing the lab coolies and breast surgeries in the regional anesthesia. So, have you taken special consent that you are going to do these surgeries under this particular type of anesthesia, or it was a normal consent?
That is a good, very good, valid question. I did explain to the patients that I'm going to give you spinal, but I did not specify about the level because in our Indian setup, they wouldn't understand. That I have not done actually, that I am giving you at a different level and the complication can be more. That I have not done, but I think ideally it should be done. But our patients are not very understanding. If you tell them anything, they'll straight away not agree for it. But I was quite confident of my work because I have seen many people doing it. So I just went ahead I of course told them about regional anesthesia, but did not mention about the level.
Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions? So should we call it a day? In the end, now I request Dr. Vandana Diwan, she is a senior consultant in our hospital, to give a vote of thanks for this ISA meet.
Hey folks, good evening to all of you. As I said, this is Dr. Vandana Dudeja Diwan, Senior Consultant at Akash Super Speciality Hospital, Dwarka. And on behalf of our organizers, I wish to thank Dr. Rajiv Gupta, who is GC National, Dr. Nikki Sabharwal, President ISA Delhi Chapter, Dr. Usha, Vice President ISA Delhi Chapter, Dr. Umesh Deshmukh, Secretary ISA Delhi, and all the office bearers for giving us this wonderful opportunity to share our experience with all of you. Also, we are eternally grateful to the ISA office bearers for their for running this program even during the challenging COVID times. I wish to thank our speakers who have enlightened us with this academic feast. And in the end, I would like to thank all of you who have spared your valuable time, and looking forward to another opportunity like this next year. Stay tuned. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Vandana. I think now we will call it a day and enjoy our weekend. I wish you all good luck for next year, and hope that we are free of COVID in this year. Good luck to all of you.
Yeah, just a line from me too, Dr. Popli. So a big thank you for the wonderful clinical meeting. And the speakers all the speakers were excellent in their presentations and their, the material that they have presented. So really enjoyed the evening. Thank you all so much. I know it takes a lot of hard work, guys, but you all have done a great job. So kudos, long live our ISA. And yes, we're looking forward to your active participation. We must also start thinking about the annual conference and what activities we would like to do during the coming months. So I think with the COVID coming down, I'm hoping that we could start, some physical workshops, limited numbers and spacing, etc. So do give us your ideas. And thank you all once again. Have a great evening and a great weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Nikki. Thanks a lot, ma'am.